Jesus Christ, Joel. What do you do?
I saved her.
And she believed you?
I didn't say otherwise.
I, like most, adore The Last of Us. It was a masterpiece upon its launch in 2013 and still is 7 years later. It's a game you can hold up to non-gamers next to greats from movies, TV and books like The Godfather, Breaking Bad, Lord of the Rings for example, to show that not only are video games an important platform, but that they can transcend the long-held children's toys discourse and be elevated to their own status of masterpiece. So of course, hype levels were off the charts when in 2016 a sequel was announced. I, like many others however, was always of the belief that The Last of Us could and probably should be a one-off game. It was as close to perfect as we'd potentially ever gotten to that point. So does The Last of Us Part 2 justify its existence, or is it just another forced sequel? Well, that's what we're going to find out. Welcome to Eat Sleep Game, my name is Luke and I've been playing The Last of Us Part 2. Quick side note before we get started, there will be no spoilers here. There will be a full spoiler cast over on the Game for All podcast. Visually, The Last of Us Part 2 is truly jaw-dropping. Characters look incredible and the level of detail on them is simply outstanding. Most impressive, however, are the facial animations. They've taken the incredible groundwork they did in Uncharted 4 and just doubled down, telling just as much story through expression alone. The level of detail put into the world of The Last of Us Part 2 is just as incredible as the character models, if not more so. The intricacies of each explorable building and environment is truly a wonder. The weather effects are equally as impressive, from snow being thick and heavy and making it difficult to trudge through, to the rain coating the world and masking your footsteps. Yet one misstep and your feet will fail you, giving away your location. This, paired with the outstanding level design, makes for a living, breathing, if a little overgrown world. Finally, the infected are more gruesome than before, with the extra time mutating them that bit further, slowly becoming one with nature, to of course spread their spores far and wide. The Last of Us Part 2 is truly beautiful. The Last of Us was renowned for its incredible vocal performances, and Part 2 is no exception to that. The game's story relies heavily on the acting, bringing the great writing to life. The cast is stellar, with the return of Troy Baker, Ashley Johnson, and the addition of such talented voices of Laura Bailey and Ashley Birch, as well as the likes of Jeffrey Wright and Shannon Woodward from Westworld on top of the already ridiculously talented cast, makes The Last of Us Part 2 one of, if not the most, star-studded cast in a video game to date. Each actor brings their vast experience and gives their absolute all to their respective characters, and making each one three-dimensional and so very layered.
Refreshing.
Yeah, it's not nice getting pushed in, is it?
Well, actually, we need to swim through this part anyway.
I got you back. You're angry and upset.
I am very angry and upset. Now, come on.
Ugh.
The iconic sounds of the infected make their unwelcome return, from the gut-wrenching and rasping screams of the newly infected to the horrifying clicking of the notorious clickers. The weather effects are equally as outstanding. They really nailed the feel of the rain hammering down around you or the snow crumbling under your boots. But the most satisfying sound in the entire game, without question, is that of shattering glass. Even Stone Cold Steve Austin would be proud. And finally, we of course have to talk about Gustavo Santaolalla and his incredible work on the soundtrack. This is one of the areas of the game that really nails down the game is a continuation. Gustavo reuses some iconic themes you know and love, but they have evolved with the game and its characters. Some are slower and feel a lot more somber to match the darker tones of this game, but still with some lighter, more hopeful tones mixed in as well. His music feels just a bigger part of the world as the infected. The gameplay is really where you feel the growth of The Last of Us. While at the time Part 1 was revered for its different approach to combat and the more unpolished, fumbling nature, people did complain of it being too stiff and clunky. Perhaps it was the way they wanted Joel to feel, or perhaps it was just the time. Gaming has come quite a long way in 7 years. However, neither criticism can be made of Part 2. While they have kept the scrappiness of combat, Ellie's movements feel so much more fluid. You can feel the groundwork of Part 1 and its fundamentals still in place, but they have built something better on those foundations. Ellie is a very different beast to Joel, which makes for an interesting yet familiar playstyle. For example, she may be smaller, so not being able to pack the same punch as Joel, but she can squeeze through tight gaps to surprise her enemies, get a better angle, or escape. She's quicker too, being able to outrun a lot of her enemies and get back into some semblance of cover and go again. Stealth plays a huge part here, and it is so well implemented, due in part to again the incredible level design, but the gameplay backs up those well crafted levels to bring you some of the best stealth gameplay to date. And you of course cannot have great stealth without clever AI. Now, while they are definitely not the smartest in the universe, you are never truly safe. They can and will spot you in grass should they get close. They will check under cars and around corners, so you have to constantly be looking for your next bit of cover or be ready for the ensuing fight. This being a Naughty Dog game, there are a lot of collectibles to pick up along your journey, from the Top Trump style collector cards with bios for each character, a few artifacts nodding at other games, and coins from different states for the collectors out there, to the famed letters making their return and adding a lot of depth to the world. Despite none of their collective stories reaching the heights of Ish from Part 1, they are still worth collecting and reading through, because in certain points throughout the game they will add quite a lot to what you're about to do or just experienced. Also returning are the safes that are placed around the world, but they are a little bit more tricky than in Part 1. Their combinations are now found through environmental puzzles. You will often still find a note, but those notes now only give you a clue, and I honestly thought this was a really clever way to encourage exploration, and once again just shows off a bit more of that incredible level design. You will also find workbenches, and like everything else from Part 1, they can do more than ever before. While the upgrade systems have remained pretty similar, the animations have been given a huge amount of polish and look incredible. My favourite part about the workbenches, however, is that they can be used as traps by your enemies who sneak up and attack you while you're busy crafting. Finally, Ellie carries around a journal in which she shows off her pretty good artistic skills and shares her innermost thoughts. I really hope they actually make a physical version of this. I would buy it in an instant. While I'm not a big collectible hunter kind of guy, I really appreciated the variety of ways to collect things. The safe codes in particular added a bit more depth and thought process to what could have been a much more monotonous task.
There.
A new game, of course, pretty much requires some new enemies, and The Last of Us 2 delivers. Shamblers are huge, gross, and extremely deadly. If you get too close, your head will promptly and gruesomely be removed from your shoulders. Their main attack is emitting a toxic cloud, which not only whittles down your health, but impairs your vision too, allowing other nearby enemies a chance to rush in and bombard you. You will also come across a new one-off horror show of an infected, which I will not spoil because it is truly something to behold. A lot of returning infected feel very different. Stalkers are the most notable, as they now sneak around and will try and attack you from behind, and especially creepy is when you catch a glimpse of one poking its head out from a corner and eerily shooting off the second it's spotted. They are difficult to hunt down because they are so fast and they are too quiet to be picked up in listen mode. Clickers, unfortunately, are the opposite. They were notorious for their heart-stopping nature in the first game. All it took was a single soundbite and the entire situation was flipped. However, they're nowhere near as troublesome. They're much easier to get around, escape from, and deal with. They just no longer fill you with any kind of dread, really. They work a bit more as a tool than anything, which, while extremely useful at points, is just a shame. The biggest improvement is that the infected can now, in some cases, work as a team. As mentioned, the Shamblers will emit a toxic cloud, nearly blinding you and enabling other infected to run in and attack. while stalkers will sneak around and alert other infected to your location, practically disabling your ability to sneak around for the stealth kills, which livens gameplay up that bit more, not allowing you to constantly stick to the same game plan. An overall welcome, if challenging, addition. There are of course two new warring factions in the game, the Washington Liberation Front, or Wolves, who really kind of just feel like Fireflies or any other armed enemy from the first game, just with some smarter AI and occasionally a dog that, while initially intimidating, turns out to be generally ineffective once you get used to them. The second faction are the Seraphites, and they are much more intimidating, mostly because they are a lot smarter and unrelenting. You know you are in trouble from the second you hear that whistle in the distance. They are far more organised and tactical than the other enemies in the game, and unless you are careful, they will swarm you from every side within moments. The whistling for me takes over from the clickers as the most unsettling sound in the game, mostly because you've got no idea where it came from until it is too late. Both factions get a fair amount of development and become more than just common enemies to kill. You learn about their roots, beliefs, and both factions have their believers and doubters among them, adding a more human depth to them and making you see and understand their goals and actions, even if you don't agree with them. However, I feel like the Seraphites needed a bit more character development. There was a lot of interesting stuff in there, but it didn't really go too deep. Quick side note, the addition of these enemies shouting names when finding a body, while a nice touch, didn't really do anything for me. It does make the groups feel a little bit more realistic rather than having them shout about this random body they just found. It does kind of make it seem like it was a real person and one that they actually cared about. It just didn't really make me care any more or less, because I had no attachment to that character. I didn't even know their name until they were already dead. The on-the-fly crafting does again remain pretty much the same from part 1, however you will find and craft a larger variety of devices to help you enact your revenge on enemies, from smoke and stun bombs and trip mines, to finally being able to craft arrows and their more explosive counterparts. Out of all the new craftable items, I found the silencers the most useful, as I prefer to stealth my way through the majority of encounters. You will also again come across training manuals which not only grant a new skill tree to upgrade, you also unlock new crafting recipes, which is a really cool way to introduce a number of new items into the game more organically. Speaking of, I just want to touch on the skill trees really quick, because while I don't think they fit extremely well, I do appreciate how simplistic and straightforward they are. There's no stupidly long branches, they're all 5 upgrade deep and very clear, concise, and are somewhat useful for different playstyles. Performance wise, I had very little issue with the game. Last of Us Part 2 ran near perfectly for me, which for a game of this scope and fidelity is impressive. I did encounter the occasional minimal bit of pop in, by which I mean literally a single bit of environment would rarely pop in, and I did notice a few times that secondary characters would occasionally be out of sync with their dialogue. The only real issue I found was with the camera when dodging. The camera can have a difficult time keeping up, and I found that I'd lose track of the enemy, which when dodging a big hitter was super annoying because they don't pull their punches, so it often meant losing a chunk of health. Otherwise, as I said, the game ran incredibly well. It was near perfect.
I don't know what happened.
Finally, let's discuss the story. As I've said, this is spoiler free, so I'll be as vague as possible. In short, this is a tale of love, revenge, obsession, and consequences. And the game does an incredible job of showing all facets of this. You see how much this journey has taken a toll on Ellie and straining her relationships, as well as the toll it takes on everybody around the story too. There are so many layers to part 2 that it's impossible to go through in under 8 hours. Honestly, it's such a well thought out and deep story, it's almost beyond belief. Part 2 is much more relationship based than the individual stories like Sam and Henry from part 1. Every relationship is multifaceted, And while you don't get the individual moments like in part 1, you do get deeper, more complex, and therefore realistic feeling characters. While each notable character you encounter has different motivations and goals, they are fully justified, and the game does an exceptional job of making you understand why they're doing what they're doing. It's just up to you whether you agree with them or not. Even Ellie, as beloved as she is, would do things that I wholeheartedly disagreed with, but I fully understood why she did them. My only pacing issue with the game comes around halfway in, but the issue with that issue is that it's the only way that it really works for the greater story. I can't see any other way that they could have done it without sacrificing the story they were trying to tell. In writing this, I was acutely aware that I have very little negative to say about The Last of Us Part 2, and I took a while looking back through on multiple occasions to make sure I was being wholly honest with myself and not negating to tell you what was wrong with this game. But I failed to come up with much that was either specific to The Last of Us Part 2 or so minute and nitpicky that it wasn't worth discussing. I did originally also have a bit about ludonarrative dissonance in the game and how it wants you to feel bad about killing while constantly putting people on your plate ready to be carved up. But the more I thought about it, I found it just wasn't really the case. While yes, there are a few points in which Ellie is coming to terms with some of her victims, when I sat for a minute, it was pretty clear that it was less the actual killing, more the manner of the kill and the truth of the situation. The Last of Us Part 2 is such a high quality experience on every level imaginable, from visuals and audio to world building and themes. While a lot of people will and have compared it to more critically acclaimed books and movies rather than the genre it actually occupies, I kind of disagree with that. The Last of Us is a quintessential video game. When people ask me why I love video games, my answer is always that they offer the depth and storytelling levels of books, but they offer the visual and audio experience of film and TV. And there is no better example, in my opinion, than The Last of Us Part 2. When we look back in a few years' time, this game is going to be such an important milestone, not only for its level of quality and how, like its predecessor, lifts the medium, but also because it proves that taking risks can and does pay off when they're properly thought through and not just done for shock factor. As I mentioned way back at the beginning, I never thought I wanted nor needed a sequel to The Last of Us, but I was so very wrong. The Last of Us Part 2 is genuinely one of the best, if not the best, video game sequel to date.